Hi there, it's Kevin with the Rogue Market here with sort of a playful video talking about my most successful specs and worst specs of all time. This was suggested by a viewer. I'm going to be doing a video series with all the things that we've called on the Rogue Market specifically, kind of doing an audit on those type of cards, see how they've done about a month later or 6 months later or whatever the time period that I gave for those particular cards, and see how well we did. This particular video, I'm going to go back in time to talk about some of my best specs ever, or at least the most memorable ones. I'm not going to include some of the ones on the early days of the Rogue Deck Builder channel where I spec'd into Modern as a whole before people realized that Modern was going to be the next big thing. So we're talking about like fetch lands or fast lands like Blackcleave Cliffs and Copperline Gorge. I remember at a time period I had a ton of stock of things like even like Inkmoth Nexus. For this video, we're going to keep those out. So I'm going to talk about ones that I just remember recently of some of my greatest specs, and I even have an MTGO one for you. And then on the other end, some of the worst specs, the specs that never paid off, the specs that I regret, and I may have lost a few shirts or off my back for these particular specs. So anyway, let's get started with the worst specs of all time. I've got it up already. Number 5 is Tidebinder Mage. Tidebinder Mage was a spec that I really thought that Merfolk would eventually be a tier 1 or at least a tier 2 deck in Modern. It had some things going for it. It had some good finishes, and the card was being played of is usually a 3 of or a 4 of, if not in the main, but in the sideboard. So after this card rotated after Standard, I started picking these up around the Cons era, and for around I would say the 50, anywhere from the 25 cent to about the 75 cent mark, I was picking up the Tidebinder Mage. We're talking to the volume of something on the lines of like 300 or 400 copies of Tidebinder Mage. And as you can see, they never went anywhere. Tidebinder Mage never paid back the amount of money that I put into it, and was actually just recently reprinted in the Dual Deck Merfolk versus Goblins, which was just the last kick in the shins for me for the Tidebinder Mage. What really went wrong with Tidebinder Mage is the next bad pick, which was Harbinger of the Tides. Harbinger of the Tides is the number 4 card that I regret speccing into. So after I realized that Tidebinder Mage probably would never be able to go up in value because Harbinger of the Tides was a thing, I decided I wasn't going to give up on Merfolk, yet double down and invest in the card that I thought was the replacement to Tidebinder Mage. Well, lo and behold, the thing that happened with Tidebinder Mage, or Harbinger of the Tides, it still does see some play in Merfolk, is twofold. Merfolk just never really took off. In fact, it's completely gone in the Modern meta right now. And there was another card out of Dominaria that was just printed in that 2-drop slot that a lot of people actually prefer over the Harbinger of the Tides. But the main thing that really killed this spec was the Commander 17 printing, as well as the Dual Deck Merfolk versus Goblin. So it had a double printing, and this card was never allowed to ever accrue any sort of gain because of the amounts that were going in both of these dual decks and the commanders. So Harbinger of Tides is another card. I don't think I went as crazy as I did with the Tidebinder Mage. We're talking of maybe 100 copies, not quite up to 300, 400 copies that I had in the Tidebinder Mage. However, again, this was a very dead spec. I think I got into these about the same price point, the 35 cents to about 70 cents range. And of course, they have never panned off and have never gone anywhere. I hope that maybe someday down the road, both of these cards might go up in value, but I highly, highly doubt it. They continue to print even more Merfolk in this slot that kind of do the same sort of things. And I just don't know if Merfolk can compete in this sort of, like humans have done what Merfolk used to do. So you'll see it occasionally in Modern, but there's just not enough people playing the deck to outstretch the supply and have these cards go up. All right, so my next one, my number 3 of the worst specs, was a failed commander spec, and this is Whispering Madness. Whispering Madness I really started buying into way back in the day for kind of low price because there was the Commander, I want to say 14, or is it Commander 13? That had the Grixis deck that was all about drawing and discarding cards. I'm trying to think of the commander, very popular commander, and it just never really went anywhere. I also like to compare this to other cards like Reforge the Soul. Most of these wheel type effects have seen an increase in value at some period of time. So I thought this was just a very, very safe spec. It had a very hard mechanic to reprint in the form of Cypher, and it had a very powerful ability. So each player discarding their hand and then drawing that many cards equal the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way, I think was very easily abused in Commander when you can empty your hand, and then cast this card, refill your hand, and then put on an evasive creature to keep doing it with Cypher. And if you have a commander that does deal with discarding or drawing, well, there you go. It's in the right color combinations of blue-black. That seems to be the thing. Eventually, I thought this would see play a lot more play than it does in Commander. However, it never did. So I was being sort of aggressive with this card. I would say buying it around the market price for quite some time. So we're saying anywhere from a quarter to 50 cents for a big time period. Now, you can see that it is starting to eke up, but this is still pretty dismal that it hasn't really gone anywhere in 3, 4, 5 years. Then to make matters worse, this was reprinted in Commander 2016, just when it started to seem like it was going to go up, and it, of course, has flatlined the Whispering Madness back down into the non-investable and just non-profitable place. So very disappointed with that. That's one of them that I really thought was just a very safe bet. All right, so on to my number 2. This is another failed Commander spec. This was Aetherling, and I went all into Aetherling, not all in. We're talking about 100 to 200 copies of Aetherling. At the good news about this is I got most of these, the vast majority of these Aetherlings at the 10-cent bulk. So I did find vendors that were considering this in the bulk bin, and that's the price I was able to get into them. So technically, if I could get rid of them at 40 cents, that would be a very good increase from 10 cents to 40 cents, but we all know how unfeasible that is with Aetherling. I really went into Aetherling because of Mairsil the Pretender. I thought that everyone was going to be playing Mairsil the Pretender, and unfortunately, that is not what happened. Like, it was a popular commander, but definitely not as popular as I thought the commander was going to be, and the Aetherling just didn't move anywhere. I thought that Dragon's Maze might be investable because it didn't seem to be like a set that was open that much, but even comparative to sets that are out now, I think Dragon's Maze was actually open more than something like Rivals of Ixalan. It was just a very popular time period of Magic, and even a dismal set like Dragon's Maze in the draft type and sealed events was opened a ton. So Aetherlings are everywhere out there, and a commander like Mairsil was not enough to bring this up. I do have hope for this card in like the 3, 4, 5 years when another commander comes out that wants to abuse Aetherling. If even a card like Experimental Kraj gets reprinted in like a commander deck some down the road, maybe we'll see like Aetherling go up in value because it does have some very good abilities. This card perfectly paired with Mairsil, though, and I think that if that can't spike it up, there's really nothing that can spike it up. So Aetherling was a huge bust and hasn't gone anywhere. But by far and above, the worst spec that I've made, we're talking 400, 500 copies plus, is in the form of Underworld Cerberus. Underworld Cerberus, I started speccing into before rotation because I thought that we'd get out of the kind of monocolored hell that we were in. During Theros and Return to Ravnica, it was all about the either black decks with Pack Rat and Mutavault and Black Devotion, and then there's also Blue Devotion. And there was a lot of a very aggressive burn strategy and a very aggressive control strategy, and a lot of things that exiled creatures. So I thought once those rotated, Underworld Cerberus would be able to compete in the meta. Had a very strong ability with 5 mana for a 6/6. Can't be blocked by more than, except by 3 or more creatures. And cards and graveyards can't be the target spells or abilities, so you can fill up your graveyard. And then when it exiles, each player returns all their creature cards in their graveyard to their hand. So I'm like, this card is just bonkers good on the power level. It's got evasion. It's a 6/6 for 5, which is, above par. And it protects your graveyard. So I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be, hopefully there will be some sort of graveyard-based strategy from the Khans of Tarkir block, and this color pairing will work with the Underworld Cerberus. However, that's not what happened. The Mardu decks that came out just didn't want Underworld Cerberus when it was competing with the slot like even the Butcher. Mardu ended up not being a very popular color combination, and unfortunately during the Khans block, you were really pigeonholed into those type of shards or wedges, however you want to call the Khans. And so there wasn't something like Jund this could go into or Grixis that can go into. People were really building around those particular color combinations. And with Mardu, it just wasn't happening. It ended up being wanted to be like an aggressive deck. Even Zergu looked better on paper than something like the Underworld Cerberus. And I did end up making a few decks with this card, but they just did not end up really going anywhere. And unfortunately, I also thought this was going to be a card that might have the ability to go up because it was played in a legacy deck called Oops All the Spells, where the Underworld Cerberus was then reanimated back, then killed, and you got all your creatures to then throw back in the graveyard, rinse and repeat. And yeah, so maybe down the road, sometime down the road, this hasn't seen a reprint. It's still at basically its all-time low. I got in around the $1 mark for this card, so you can see the market price for this card is 30 cents. One of the bad things about this too is it's Theros, and Theros is definitely top 5 of the most sold sets. Remember, this was drafted as a 3 of, then as a 2 of with Born of the Gods, and then as a 1 of with Journey, Born, and Theros. So the amount of Theros packs were opened during that was the height of the GP seasons. Like, this was the time period is Theros, Return to Ravnica Theros, and Theros Konzertar Kier, where Magic was at its height. So there were just so many of these Theros cards that are out and about. It's kind of funny, though, that Burnished Heart has a better price tag than the Underworld Cerberus, so an uncommon out of the same set is outperforming a Mythic. That's just how dismal this card sees play in like all the formats that it can see play in. Just not there. Power level for Jund or for Modern. I'm thinking that maybe one day it might be, but again, that's a stretch for the Underworld Cerberus. So that was my worst spec that I can remember of all time. So let's get on to the positive specs. The first one is, of course, it's a meme, so I have to start it off, and it started as a meme, and I was very happy when the Command Zone actually promoted this card. This is Null Chamber. Null Chamber is a kind of a funny card that I started speccing into. I was looking for a reserve list card that was bulk price that didn't suck, and this was the best I could come up with. So everything around the time period that I started speculating into Null Chamber was, if it saw any sort of play, then it was already worth something. However, Null Chamber was not. It was still around the 35-cent mark, which where I really got into it. I got into it even lower, around 15 to 20 to 30. I think I started buying it all the way up to 55, 60 cents a piece. So I own a ton of Null Chambers, and I had sold a bunch into this spike. I still do own a ton of copies, and unfortunately, Card Kingdom has already set a very low price for Null Chamber. So we're talking, I still have hundreds. I think it's 500 plus copies of Null Chamber out there. But again, I got in it for very, very low. And I think I've already made my money back on the Null Chambers that I did sell for around that $4 to $6 mark that I was selling them for. So one of the things I liked about Null Chamber 2 is it was an education card. So meaning that is the more people you could actually educate that this card exists, the more people would play it. And then when the Command Zone actually talked about how good Null Chamber was in Commander, which I still do think it's one of my pet cards in Commander, I tell stories about how one game we were able to Null Chamber and lock down a Krenko and a Skithiryx on our table. And they were basically both decks that only used they were so Commander centric that they were locked out of the game and couldn't play their kind of degenerate. Both Skittles and Krenko can be very, very degenerate decks if built properly, and locked them out. And the rest of the table got to play. I think it was a table of 6, and we got to play the game without being fear of being one shot by Skithiryx or just the deck going, or the game going out of control with Krenko. So I still like Null Chamber. I think that eventually it's a reserve list card that it will probably settle down to around the $3 to $4 mark. That was kind of like my sellout rate area anyway, was around the $3. So when it went all the way up to $8 at one point, man, I was tickled pink about Null Chamber. So again, I've had better specs than this even, but this is definitely one of the most memorable. On to the next Commander card, which was just the biggest duh ever, was the Cyclonic Rift. And I was the first person to really identify this, that I got in around the $4, $5, and $6 mark for the Cyclonic Rift after it was printed in Modern Masters. If you actually check out EDH Rec, this is the second most played card in the entire game after Sol Ring. It's Cyclonic Rift as far as potential decks that it could go into. So Sol Ring goes in the most potential decks that it can, and Cyclonic Rift goes into something like over 55% of all blue decks. It is one of the most powerful cards in Commander. It's very one-sided. A lot of people want it banned out of Commander. I think it actually has like a necessary evil of keeping a lot of degenerate decks in check. And for how many deck lists were showcasing the Cyclonic Rift, I just knew that price point was way too low. And as you can see, it stayed that price point for quite some time and then just barely started eking up. This is where I really ramped up. I probably caused this little price spike here. This little, yeah, this was me, I think, of how many copies I started purchasing Cyclonic Rift. And then I was able to sell them off. I wish I would have kept some Cyclonic Rift because I actually sold them off at $12 a piece. In fact, most of them did go to the Card Kingdom when they upped their buy list to $12. So you can see that now Card Kingdom's got up to $21. Maybe I pulled the trigger a little too quick, but I was nervous about the Guilds of Ravnica, reprinting them in the kits, or reprinting them in any sort of supplemental product, or just reprinting Overload. I thought that it was very, very poised to get a return. So Cyclonic Rift, though, that's a very good increase from the $3, $4, $5, $6 mark all the way to the $12 mark, a quick double up or triple up, depending on when I got into those particular copies. And as far as recent memories, it's definitely one of my best specs. So then on to the next card, the number 3 card was Dictative Erebos. This is a spec I haven't actually cashed in on yet. I was worried that this was going to be reprinted in the Commander set, and I was going to sell them off, but I forgot. And I'm glad I forgot because now it continues to go up in value. Card Kingdom got it at $8.50, and I'm pretty sure their buy list will increase pretty soon here. You can see the price has gone way up. I got into these at 80 cents, I think, is the price point that I got them in. Like I wanted to spec, but I wanted to wait for a rotation. And unfortunately, they started being purchased before rotation. So you can see that rotation happened like right here. And as soon as they started to be purchased, I really got in on it here. And the price spiked up right after I started buying them as well. And I think I continued to kind of trade for these kind of low and buy these when I saw opportunities from I would say all the way from the 70-cent mark to the $2.50 mark. So this is another just duh card. It was seeing tons of play in a lot of EDH decks, hadn't seen a reprint. I do want to sell this card definitely before the next Commander set, definitely before we see a lot more supplemental products, because I do believe that this card has to be reprinted. It does have the word Dictative Erebos, but some of the other dictates have already seen reprints, I believe, like the Helad. Maybe I'm wrong there on Commander sets, but I do believe they have. So anyway, that's a card that I'm glad I kind of stuck onto. It's going to be a nice little payday when I do decide to sell the copies. I don't think I have too many of these. We're talking between the 40 to 60 amount of Dictative Erebos, but again, that's going to be a nice little sell-off. Funny thing is, I think I'm gonna try the Card Kingdom game. I was able to buy a bunch of specs from Guilds of Ravnica for super cheap. So I think I've identified like this pattern with Card Kingdom. When a new set comes out, they fire sell everything. And also they start to sell off cards when other formats are hot. So when Standard's hot, they have like really good deals on Modern, and vice versa. When Modern's hot, they like sell off their Standard. So I think you just have to wait and do this rinse and repeat thing with Card Kingdom. If I actually buy list these for the store credit, they even give a 30% plus on that. And I want to make just kind of a funny little a video series of buying cards and then directly selling them back to Card Kingdom. Heard horror stories, though, that Card Kingdom doesn't grade as hard as they do sending cards off as they do buying them. So anyway, we'll have to wait and see how that works. I still have some of the packages from Card Kingdom in their same packages that I bought them from them for. That's Dictative Erebos, though. It was a very, very good spec. Haven't cashed in on it yet. So now we're getting to the really juicy stuff. I've told this story a lot with the next card. This card is Hellrider. Hellrider basically was one of my first major wins, and it really got me into MTG Finance. And this was just a card that I knew was being held back by the Delver decks at the moment. Mono Red was just too slow for Delver, to be honest. It was the Delver tempo decks. There was Infect, Delver, and a zombie list. There was kind of a very just 1, 2, 3 were only decks that you could play during Standard at the end of the Scars of Mirrodin and Innistrad blocks Standard. So Hellrider, though, was just like, Burn was just right below those 3. It was like the 4th best deck or the 5th best deck. And it definitely couldn't compete with the speed of Infect, definitely couldn't compete with the speed of Zombies, and definitely couldn't compete with the tempo of Delver. But once those rotated, I thought, whoa, I looked at the list, I'm like, Red misses nothing. It's not the cards from Scars of Mirrodin aren't pushing the mono red. It's definitely being pushed by these cards out of Innistrad. And so I went all in on Hellrider about here, and this also doesn't give it justice. Like, I was finding these cards for bulk bin. So the price trajectory already started to go way down from this card. And you can see that according to Goldfish, the market price never went down past about $1.50. But I remember this clearly. I was picking these up for a quarter to 50 cents, and I picked up a ton of them. And this was more of a trade card than I wasn't buying and selling cards, but it 100% led to me being able to get every card that I wanted out of Ravnica and even Gatecrash for a long period of time as this deck went tier 1. And it just fed me. I didn't have to spend any money on Magic, and really got me kind of addicted to MTG Finance that I didn't have to, I bought a booster box with Trading and Hellriders. That's, I remember, with Ravnica. So I ended up selling off around here. I know I didn't sell off after Gatecrash, didn't hold on to them. It was about the $8, $9 mark that I sold off for the Hellrider. But again, it was just a really, really good call on and where I started to pay attention to rotation and what could be out of the next rotation. And it was a huge win for me. So now we're going to go on to my number one. And my number one is a MTGO spec in particular. Like, I do not suggest investing in MTGO at the moment just because I'm so worried about what Arena is going to do with it. In fact, I believe it was Heath, who owns Cape Fear Games / MTGO Traders. He published some data about if you were to own every card in Magic the Gathering, and the value of Magic was going up on MTGO. So, and that makes sense. Like, the more cards that were sold, or the more sets that came out, of course, it's going to cost you more per, because there's more cards. So, eventually, if everything costs 1 cent, if you add 1,000 more of them, that's 1 cent times 1,000 more that you're going to have to spend to own every card. Well, unfortunately, what his data ends up looking like is that we peaked out about a year ago of what Magic Online was worth to own every card. And now it's starting to either flatline out, which is bad, or start to go down in value, which makes no sense. More cards enter in to the MTGO, yet to own every card costs less. Yeah, that's a bad sign for Magic and Magic Online. I think that the player base is getting definitely divided into Arena and MTGO, and of course that shows in the overall value of the platform. So anyway, with that aside, let's talk about Stony Silence. Stony Silence, I noticed, was I think when I started speccing into it, was the 11th most played card in Modern. However, it was a 2 to 5 cent card on MTGO. So I went crazy. I bought like 450 copies of this card at about 5 cents and held on to them and held on to them and held on to them and held on to them, and then sold them for the $2 mark. And I wish I would have held on to a little bit longer because they got all the way up to the $8 mark. However, this spec fed my account. Like I said, I was in upwards of 500 to 600 Stony Silences. And then so the investment on that was very low. Like I said, when it's 5 cents a piece, it's what was that, $30 that I spent into it, and then was able to sell them for over 1,000 tickets. And that kept me. I basically paid $0 on MTGO for the longest time. And MTGO used to be kind of a pain for me because I was using it to do the Gathering Magic videos. And so I was trying to come up with a brew every week. And so it cost me a lot of money a lot of times to buy a bunch of cards and brew these particular rogue jank decks. And of course, I'd even enter a 5-man tournament, and a lot of my decks would do pretty bad. And so it wasn't like I was winning with those decks because, a lot of them were playing on a budget where, face a budget deck versus a tier deck, yeah, you're already a huge disadvantage. Or a lot of them were just wacky combo decks. So anyway, lost a lot of money on that sort of stuff, but the Stony Silence spec was so good that I didn't have to spend a cent on Magic the Gathering. And it really got me into the MTGO Finance, where buying and selling and finding trends and things like that. And yeah, that's exactly, it was Stony Silence that I really, really started doing this more than just a hobby, but actually as a way to make it so I never paid money on Magic. So that's kind of the takeaway of this, is people were like I don't know if MTG Finance, between fees and just the hassle, you can't really make the greatest living off of it. But if you're looking to manage your trade binder for sure, or make sure that you don't pay money playing Magic, so you kind of subsidize your hobby, this is definitely the way to go, is to get ahead of trends and be savvy in the MTG Finance world. This is kind of a long video for the rogue market. However, I think it was a fun little video. It was good to have this content out. I appreciate the suggestion for the subscriber that did ask me to do this video. Maybe we'll talk about some of these other specs I've done over the history of the years. There's been some good ones, like I said, but we will definitely audit all of the rogue roundups and all of the Market Monday recaps or any other specs that we do choose. I'm going to have kind of like a September audit coming up where we'll look at all those specs and see where they went. We already have some good ones like History of Benalia. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.